My name is Justin, and I am a son of God and an addict and the host of the RECO12 speaker meeting. And thanks to my God, the steps, and the fellowship of other addicts, I am sober one day at a time since June 19th, 2015. And for that, I am beyond grateful. Welcome to RECO12. We are an organization whose addictions include alcohol, drugs, lust, and sex, food, and gambling, just to name a few. We come together from all places, faiths, and backgrounds to learn the similarities of addiction and to gain tools and hope from others who are walking a similar path. We invite recovering addicts with at least 1 year sobriety and who are actively working their recovery in their respective fellowships to share their experience, strength, and hope on a live Zoom webinar each Friday at noon Central Time for 20 to 25 minutes. Then we, the live audience, get the opportunity to ask questions of that speaker for another 20 to 25 minutes. If you're hearing this meeting in recorded podcast form and would like to participate as a live audience member in the future, we have a good audience every week that comes together and helps us with these questions and answers. Please go to RECO12.com. That's www.reco12.com to learn more and to submit your email address there to receive weekly invitations. RECO12 is self-supporting, and we appreciate your help in keeping us working our 12th step in this manner. We gratefully accept contributions to help cover the cost of the Zoom platform, podcast platform, web hosting, and administrative costs. To contribute, you can go to RECO12.com/support, or you can click the link to PayPal that will be here in the chat of the live meeting and also in the show notes of the podcast. When you contribute, please specify which meeting it is, and this is meeting number 73. One more word about our speakers before we introduce today's speaker. When we line up a guest speaker for a meeting, we ask them to seek guidance on what and how to present so that they can reflect the light they have been given. That light will hopefully inspire hope, meaning, worth, and growth in us, the listening audience. Now let's introduce today's speaker, Ryan L., whose topic is honest self-amends, and I'm excited to see where this goes. Now here's a little bit about Ryan. If asked about Ryan L.'s most prominent character trait growing up, his family would likely cite his need to be right. This trait caused him to inwardly and sometimes outwardly push his family members aside at the cost of the loving connections that he needed as a sensitive kid. Through his parents' attempts at sexual education, Ryan learned that sex was supposed to be a loving, connecting thing. Never mind that it was only supposed to be used in marriage. At 8 years old, he discovered masturbation, and then at 14, he discovered pornography and used them to avoid having to admit that he was wrong. His inner child never had a chance to grow up because he couldn't admit his mistake or accept his family members in their imperfections. Instead, he hid that boy away behind walls of half-truths, outright lies, and secrecy. Resentment became a way of life, and it only progressed with the patience of sexual addiction. However, while watching his brothers change from the darkness of his own addictions to light, Ryan saw something that he wanted, real change and light. Ryan began working the 12 steps of recovery with ARP support, sponsorship, and SAL groups. One of the most powerful experiences he has had in the last 2+ years of recovery was the amends he made and still works on today to God and to himself. Take it away, Ryan. The floor is yours.
Hey, thanks, Justin. I appreciate it. I spent a lot of time trying to summarize my story for the beginning of this share and forgot that I had done so for that introduction. It was really helpful, actually. I'm really, really grateful to be here. Probably not grateful enough, but I am extremely grateful for God, the members of my groups, and for recovery. I'll just introduce myself really, really quickly, how I do in meetings. My name is Ryan. I am a sex addict. That means I'm addicted to lust. My sobriety date is August 16th of 2019. I'm also a son of God worth recovering. I just to kind of summarize and kind of give my own version of the third step prayer, I offer this up to God, and I pray that this will not be about me, but it will be about Him and about that hopefully my experience and and my story will help somebody to have a little bit more faith, a little bit more hope moving forward in their own addiction, in their own recovery. And I pray that it'll help turn people to God and to their higher power. Let's see. One thing that I felt that I ought to start with, I've heard a lot of really, really good one-liners and quick little lessons in recovery. And one of them comes from an experience not a terribly long time ago. There was somebody in my meeting. I attend SAL groups online, and we have what we affectionately term the parking lot after the actual meeting. Whoever can will stick around for a few minutes, sometimes more than a few minutes, and we'll chat. It gives a chance for opportunities for people to ask questions and just to have good connecting conversation. And one evening after a meeting, there was a particular member of our group who shared his feelings about not wanting recovery very consistently. And he asked the question, how do I, what do I do if I don't really want recovery all the time? I know I should want it, but I just don't all the time. And I'm going to give credit to Harvey here because he's the one that said it, and it really has stuck with me as being a true principle of recovery. And he said that not everybody who needs recovery gets it. Only those who want recovery get it. And then he said what I think was really, really important in terms of relationship with myself. He said, if you want recovery, it means you think you're worth it. So I kind of want to start out with that as kind of the backdrop as to my share today, and kind of summarizing my story. Justin kind of already shared a little bit my backstory, the 1 minute version. Just a really quick anecdote on my family growing up. I probably, if you ask anybody in my family, I'm probably the most different from anybody in my family. My whole family is medical, and then I'm an engineer. So I just think different. I am different, I think, from the rest of my family. And there's my addict talking. I think I'm different, right? But it was one of those things where I always thought I was right, when really I was just thinking different, I think, was a lot of it. And I don't think that was necessarily a question of right or wrong now. But we had kind of a fun tradition in our family. There were 6 of us kids, and when each of us got married, the rest of the siblings and my parents would put together a survival kit for the incoming in-law. And one of the things, most of it was kind of some funny ribbing kind of things that went on. And so we would do little funny things to kind of help overcome idiosyncrasies and things like that. And one of the things that was in my wife's survival kit was a framed piece of paper that said, would I rather be right or would I rather be married? That's how big of a deal that was for me, is I always had to be right. I like to think that softened over time, especially as I've been in recovery. It's one of the biggest fruits of recovery, I think, has been being able to say that I'm wrong and that I don't know everything. Looking at a little bit more detail at the way that my parents taught me about sex. My dad is an obstetrician gynecologist, and he is much more, he's an introvert, and he's much more comfortable talking to women about sex than he is men or boys. And so my parents worked out this deal where my mom was going to talk to the boys, my brother and me. My dad talked to the girls. And to teach us about sex and to have that sex education talk, my mom took us out to the horses. She bred horses. And she basically said, that's what sex is, after showing us breeding the horses. And I remember essentially 3 things, mostly 2. I remember my mom saying that people do it because they love each other, and they do it because it feels good. And of course, the third thing that I just kind of shoved out of my mind was the idea that it was only supposed to be done in marriage, and that it was specifically for that time and place. It didn't take me too much longer as a kid who did not feel connected with his siblings to figure out masturbation, and my world exploded. It was a way to short circuit the connection. One of the things that the SA White Book says is it says that it says our habit made true intimacy impossible. We could never know real union with another because we were addicted to the unreal. We went for the chemistry, the connection that had the magic, because it bypassed intimacy and true union. Fantasy corrupted the real, lust killed love. And that was absolutely true for me. And really, even mostly as an adult, I look back at that and I can see exactly that's what I was doing. Is I was going to masturbation and then later pornography precisely because it cut out all the work. It cut out all the work, and it cut out my responsibility to sometimes admit that I was wrong. Looking back at my life and my relationships with my siblings, I don't necessarily regret the past or wish to shut the door on it. That's one of the promises that comes that's mentioned in the big book through recovery. But I do feel still a lot of remorse for the lost opportunities and the lost opportunity to express love and acceptance for my siblings. And really, when I was acting out through masturbating and viewing pornography, it was all about having to, or being able to not admit that I was wrong. It was all about being able to skip the work that would have been necessary to really have a connection with my siblings. So fast forward a whole bunch through a lot of stuff because I don't want to focus on the problem. I'd rather focus on the solution. My addiction included eventually getting into some pornographic gaming and eventually chat rooms. Chat room is a scary place for someone like me. I very much felt like I was living a double life at that point. And I got to the point in my acting out where I just felt absolutely sick every time. And I didn't want to do it anymore. But I didn't feel like I had a choice. There always came this moment in my acting out where a switch was flipped. And I knew that I was going to act out no matter how long it took to get there. I could have maybe white knuckled for a couple of days, and I just knew I was going to act out. And eventually my thought process is, well, I might as well just act out tonight so I can get rid of that feeling. And it was a really low place for me to be. In all of this, eventually I served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I had gotten my life kind of cleaned up enough to go on a mission. I ended up acting out on my mission through masturbation, told my mission president about it, terrified because I knew I was going to get sent home from my mission. And in an act of love and grace, he kept me there, which I think was the best thing that God could have done for me in those circumstances with what I knew and with what I was willing to know. Because I really wanted to do what was right at that point. I really did. I also didn't know how to get rid of it. I didn't know how to find recovery. I didn't really know what recovery was. I didn't really know what addiction was at that time. Eventually got back from my mission and started into ARP meetings, which is the 12-step program run by the church. And the problem that I had there is that there was nobody in those rooms with recovery. The most anybody had at a given point in time was maybe 2 weeks. This is a revolving door of maybe 2 weeks of sobriety. And I'd show up at groups just like everybody else, and we'd have these wonderful conversations, learning about the steps, thinking, man, if I learn about these steps, that's going to set me free because knowledge is power, right? I'm a smart guy, and if I know enough, then I'll be okay, right? That was my thought process. I kind of came to find out that didn't really work. I fast forward again a little ways, and my brother had started into real recovery. He had actually started working the steps. It was super apparent. I didn't know that's what he was doing, but it was super apparent that something was different because he was not the same person anymore. And I started to see what I wanted. Man, he went from this person that didn't really want to connect with anybody, at least that was our perception on the outside, to somebody who was at least being honest with his emotions. And it was kind of a little bit rough there for a little bit as he actually was present and not acting out. And then finally he started to make these changes where he was willing to talk and he was willing to connect. And it was this amazing change, just night and day difference in the guy. And eventually I finally understood, and he started talking to me about this program called ARP support. And it was a program where it was initially there to kind of help with ARP to provide a sponsor. So there was accountability, and then kind of attach a schedule to working the steps so that you didn't get stuck on something like step 4, which I think most people who have tried working the steps knows that it's really easy to get stuck on step 4. There's so many people who get stuck there. And we'll touch on that here in a little bit. But the point is, one night after a meeting, I had stopped going to meetings for a while. I got married and then started acting out again. I was upfront and honest with my wife about it the whole time before we got married. And when I started acting out again, she knew I was struggling. She lovingly suggested to me, after we read the first essay in a book called Sitting in a Rowboat Throwing Marbles at a Battleship, and he talks about the need to go to meetings. My wife lovingly suggested and gently suggested maybe it was time to start going back to meetings. So what did I do? I did the addict thing, and I went back to the least uncomfortable situation I could, and I went back to that exact same meeting, the exact same place, same time. And lo and behold, everyone was different. Nobody that had been going a year and a half before was the same. And the important part is there was a guy there who was 4.5 years sober, who actually knew how to work the steps. And there was another guy there who was really working the steps. He is just about his year mark when I first started going back. And there was another guy who started going the week after I got there, who had hit his, no joke, rock bottom and was willing to do anything it took for recovery. And one night I heard that phrase. One of those guys said, "You have to be willing to do whatever it takes." And I recognized that I knew what those words meant, but I didn't know what the phrase meant. And so my wife was going to the support group just down the hall, and I said, "Why don't you go ahead and drive home? I'm going to walk home a couple blocks, and I'm going to call my brother." So I called him and I said, "Hey, what does this mean?" And he proceeded to share his experience with me a little bit. And he then started to say, he then started to kind of ask me what I was doing to work on the steps. Essentially, I think what he was trying to do is to get to a place in that conversation where he could help me understand what I was willing to do and what I wasn't willing to do. And I responded by saying, "Well, I know I need to be going to meetings and working and really like doing things." And he said, "Stop it! You're trying to do it yourself." And kind of took me off guard, and I was like, "Okay, well, I know that I need to like fix my relationship with God, and I just need to make sure that I'm praying." And he said, "Ryan, stop it! You're trying to do it yourself." Oh, man, you're right. I know I need to be reading my scriptures and making sure that I am like really in the scriptures. And stop it, Ryan! You're trying to do it yourself. And no joke, it took like 25 things before I finally just shut up and said, "So what you're trying to tell me is that literally everything I'm saying I need to do is me trying to do it myself, without God, without my higher power," right? It took far too much time for me to wake up to that idea. But through that conversation, I first got my first glimpse of Ryan is powerless over this addiction. And my lack of effort and my lack of working on things that I needed to do was an evidence of my unmanageability. So fast forward a little bit, I eventually decided to work on the steps through ARP support. And my experience was a good one, but I recognized that first time through that there were some things missing from my steps 1 through 3. And things kind of fell apart once I got to step 9. There were a couple people on my list of people I needed to make amends with that I just said, I don't even really need to talk to them. They probably don't even know anything was like up. like I probably really don't have to do anything. And it just put this wedge between me and God, my higher power, because I just wasn't willing to do it. It was a choice that I made to just not do it, even though I knew he wanted me to, and I just didn't do it. And from that point on out, I was on my own, and that started a period of dishonesty where eventually I acted out and I didn't tell anybody about it. And faking it till you make it doesn't really work that way. Dishonestly faking and making it doesn't really work in recovery. Didn't work for me. Eventually I got to my real rock bottom, which is I was acting out, like I mentioned earlier, enough that I just felt sick. I couldn't justify it anymore, and I just wanted out. And so I went back to ARP support, who had changed their requirements to start attending SAL meetings a couple times a week, and to make phone calls to somebody with a year or more of sobriety. The point of making those phone calls is to find somebody who's actually in recovery. The year or more of sobriety, I think, is mostly just a guideline to say, no, look, like you got to talk with people who actually get it. You got to find people who have what you want and talk with them about it. Talk to them about their recovery, because they have what you want. Odds are it's going to bless you to talk with people who have what you want. And so I started doing that because it was required by the program. And eventually I got back to step 9. And I knew that's where I had gone wrong before. I knew at this point that because of things I was hearing from people in group and making those phone calls, I knew there were things about steps 1 through 3 that I wasn't quite good on yet, but I knew I needed to go back and work them. So I made a commitment to myself to go back and work on those again. But my focus at the time was on step 9, steps 8 and 9. And I knew through that process of working step 4 that I needed to put 2 people on that list. I needed to put God, and I needed to put myself on that list. Now, one of the things that I've heard in groups, one of the things I was taught is that working amends, step 9, is not about asking for forgiveness. I have absolutely zero control over what anybody else is going to say when I make amends. And so expecting forgiveness or asking for forgiveness is a setup for failure. However, there are 2 people on that list that you should absolutely 100% expect forgiveness from. And if you don't get forgiveness from these 2 people, then you've got some more work to do in some of the earlier steps. Person number 1 is God, or your higher power. You should absolutely 100% expect forgiveness from him. And number 2 is you should be able to expect forgiveness from yourself. And that's a hard thing to accept. That was for me. Because at the time, I still struggled with feelings of self-hate. I lost all self-respect through the practice of my addiction. I did not love myself. I was very critical of myself still. So I got to a point where I was working on my amends, and I was going down my list, and I talked to everybody on my list. And it got down to my amends with God and with myself. And I focused for a little bit on my amends with myself. I knew that going back and really working my amends with God, doing a living amends with that, and it also included going back and reworking step 2 by this point. But for myself, I figured it would be a really good idea to write myself a letter. So I wrote myself a letter, and it was the most honest conversation that I had ever had with myself. And it took me 3 days to write 4 paragraphs because I just did not want to do it. I was not feeling connected to it at all. I finally wrote this letter, and by the end of the letter, I knew that it had some elements in it of self-acceptance and some hard expressions of this is where I'm at. I'm sorry. I knew I was never going to have that conversation with myself and share that with myself honestly if I didn't do it in a group. So I asked one of my groups if I could read that as my share. It was a little bit long to share, but I read that letter to myself. I'm not going to share that here because it's an extremely personal one. But essentially, I said, look, I'm really sorry. I need to take some time and acknowledge that I have not listened to you. I have run from your emotions. I've hid you up and pushed you down and not listened. That was a big part of what that amends letter included. And by the end of the letter, I got into a place where I wrote down kind of my plan and expressed my plan for what my amends would look like moving forward. And that included listening to myself when I felt angry, listening to myself when I felt sad or depressed, listening to myself when I felt anxious or fearful, and not listening to those to perpetuate the feeling, not listening to anger to hold on to it, right? But listening to validate and to say, yeah, that stinks, that hurts, doesn't it? Yeah, that is kind of scary to feel like your ambitions at work are threatened. Yeah, that is a really sad thing that this happened. And then to just sit with myself for a minute and acknowledge those, and then to let them go. But really the other part of it is to not only just listen to it, but strive to understand what it was that the inner child was trying to get at by saying, I'm angry, or I hurt, or I'm sad right now. And trying to be there for myself. And it was up to that point by far the most impactful thing that I had ever experienced in recovery. Was the beginnings of a relationship with myself. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences I had. Now, kind of wrapping some things up here before we run out of time. What does the rest of my self-amends look like? And why did I call it honest self-amends? Well, first of all, it has to be honest. It has to be 100% completely honest, no hiding from anything else anymore. If I hide, I'm going to be dishonest. I know that about myself. I'm going to cover up with a half-truth. I'm going to avoid, and I can't avoid if I'm going to accept. Those two things cannot coexist. And so that's the honest part of it. I have to be willing to be honest, to listen, to accept myself. The first part of that is really going back and looking at step one. Am I powerless? What am I powerless over? I am powerless over lust. I have allergic reactions to it. Lust, I think it's really important to understand what the White Book says about lust. The definition of lust in the White Book is it does not mention sex, whereas we think about it as a culture as a sex thing. But what the definition is in the White Book on page 40 is it says, if I can find my note, it says that it's an attitude demanding a natural instinct serve unnatural desires. I see a real quick question in there. The White Book is, sorry, it's a white book, but it's the Sexaholics book. The cover is all white, so we call it the White Book. But the definition of lust there is that it's an attitude demanding that a natural instinct, such as sex, such as eating, such as relationships, such as any number of things, such as anger or resentment, right? Serve unnatural desires. It's a mismatch of the action with the intended solution. Sex was not meant to fix anger. Sex was not meant, it's not there and not meant to make me better at my job, right? It's not meant for me to be able to run and hide from my emotions. It's not what it's there for. And so my living amends to myself includes going back and understanding that I am powerless over lust of a sexual nature. I also have to be very careful, and in some ways I'm powerless over relationship lust, not in a sexual way. I have to be really careful, and I am powerless over social media addiction. So I have to understand that. I have to understand and be honest about the unmanageability of my life, how I can't make decisions on my own. I can't guide my own life. God has to do that. I have to go to him and ask, and then I have to be willing to do what he says. That's not ever going to work, though, if I don't take step two, which is the next part of my self-amends. it's all about that. There's so much time we could spend on the rest of these steps, but really working on fixing my relationship with God in a very real, active way, being willing to love and listen to him and invite him to be part of my daily life. And then giving my will to him as part of step 3. And then one of the most beautiful tools that I use on a daily basis that makes up a huge part of my living self-amend, and I'll end with this, is the tools that I learned to use in step 4, going through my past and using those different pieces of step 4, those different tools in step 4 to identify when certain circumstances arise, when I'm resentful, when I harm somebody in some way, shape, or form, when I'm unkind, right? Using the tools to identify what happened, and then getting to the core of it, which is what part of me felt threatened. Was it that I felt like my relationships with others were affected? Was it that I felt like my ambitions were being threatened? Was it that I felt my safety was threatened, right? Coming to that place really helps me to understand myself. That's the core of what I wrote to myself in my letter. And then moving through the rest of that step by understanding, okay, what do I need to do moving forward? That really makes up step 10 for me, is living those steps as part of my step 10. Doing so really puts me in a much more free place, and it helps me to stay connected with myself and with God, and to continue to believe that God forgives me, and for me to feel forgiveness for myself. I'll go ahead and end there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan. Fantastic share. I really appreciate your willingness to share your story and share your experience, strength, and hope. We're now going to move on to the question and answer portion of this speaker meeting. If any of you in the live audience have questions to pose to Ryan, please type them in the Q&A link there at the bottom of your Zoom window. Looks like 2 speech bubbles over the top of each other, and we've got a few that have come in, and I've written down a few also. Ryan, we'll go ahead and get started with the first question that came in from our live audience member, Harvey. Harvey asks, and this looks like a 2-part question. He says, can you please speak a little about the living amends that are part of the amends you've done with yourself? And also, how is the relationship you have with Ryan different than before recovery?
Yeah. Harvey, thanks for your questions. Man, I just on a personal note to you, Harvey, I'm really grateful for the role that you play in my recovery. A lot of this came about because of the things that I learned from Harvey, and listening to Harvey talk about his relationship with his self. You talk about in recovery that what I mentioned earlier is you find the people who have what you want, and talking with them because they have what you want. That's what I saw in Harvey when Harvey started coming to the group I was in. It's been a blessing to me. I talked a little bit about kind of the specifics as to what I do. A lot of that really is identifying when I'm feeling disturbed, right? When I'm feeling off, when I'm feeling angry, anxious. You have all sorts of acronyms out there, the HALT acronym, a whole bunch of other ones, right? That kind of help identify when there is one of those harder emotions that I want to run from. And notice I didn't say that there were any negative emotions. It's part of my self-amends is that I refrain from saying that there are negative emotions because I don't believe in telling myself that I'm bad anymore. Sometimes those thoughts come. When those thoughts come, I try to stop for a second, listen, and understand what I'm going through so I can understand where they come from. So I can have that conversation with myself that says, all right, Ryan, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're going through. But remember, you're okay, and you're gonna be okay. And I love you. God loves you, and we can work through this, right? And so having those conversations, identifying what the emotions are, is really helpful. But really going through, and again, that beautiful experience of like it finally clicked one day, actually not too long ago. Using the tools from step 4 in a daily self-amends kind of way, to be able to say, okay, so what am I feeling disturbed about? This came about because I had driven an hour away to to go get my windshield replaced because there's a glass shortage. Thank you, pandemic. I showed up 15 minutes early. It was awesome. I got there 15 minutes early, and an hour and 15 minutes later, they still hadn't even asked for my keys. And I was starting to feel a little resentful. And I was starting to feel anxious about it, because that's what happens to me is when I start feeling some of those feelings that won't go away, some of those reactionary emotions, such as anger that turns to resentment, or fear that turns to anxiety, or sadness that turns to depression, right? I tend to hold on to those. And so I recognized that was happening. I knew I needed to make a phone call. So I reached out to somebody. I had a specific thought to talk to somebody, and didn't get a response back right away. I ended up saying, "Hey, here's my keys. I'm going to walk down the street, grab some lunch. Let me know when the car's done." And a couple of things came to mind as I was waiting for that person to respond to me. One was, again, this is something that comes from Harvey. So thank you again, Harvey, for this. Was the thought that I'm not in charge of results. God's in charge of results. I'm just in charge of doing the work that He asks me to do. So if I do the work, I don't expect a certain result. If I do expect a certain result, that's something to surrender and let go of. Because God's in charge of making sure that the bus ends up where it's supposed to be. He's in charge of making sure that the results end up as they're supposed to end up for my best benefit. He's got my back. If I really truly believe that from step 2, then I can trust and say, yeah, the result is going to be what it needs to be. And so I had that thought come to mind, and I said, okay, so what am I supposed to do right now? If I really truly believe that, I went back and I worked steps 1 through 3 and said, okay, so I trust God with this. And then I worked essentially a mini step 4 on this experience of just feeling resentment for having been there 15 minutes early and not even having them start on my car for an hour and 15 minutes, right? It just seems like a super stupid and simple thing now, but it was a big deal at the moment. And so I worked through the step, and I said, this is what's happening. Yep. They're late getting my car in. Okay. I even heard them on the phone. This is the other thing that kind of set me off, is I heard them on the phone calling a customer who hadn't been in. They just didn't show up for their appointment. That was like a half hour late for mine, later than mine. So I was like, what? Like, how are you that late if you have people not showing up? Didn't compute, right? And so I said, that's what I'm frustrated about. And then I quickly went into the question of, what do I feel is threatened? Well, I had all these plans. I had all these things that I wanted to be able to get home and work on. So my ambitions for the day, my plan for the day was feeling threatened. I was feeling threatened about that. And as soon as I recognized that, I was like, oh, but God's got my back, right? Because I just went back and worked step 2. I can trust Him. I really can trust Him. And He loves me. I'm going to be okay. He's in charge of the results. There must be a reason as to why it's not happening, right? At least I can choose to look at it that way. And from that, God taught me this beautiful, beautiful lesson about using step 4 to process those emotions and to get in touch with myself, to recognize where I feel threatened, to accept myself, and to move forward. And to answer the second question for Harvey, like, my relationship with myself is not at all the same. Yeah, I still have some of those negative self-harming thoughts. Not that I like physically self-harm, but emotionally self-harm, right? They still come from time to time. I'm so grateful for there's a share in, I think it's step 7 of Step into Action, that says something along the lines of sometimes my negative characteristics will come back stronger than they've ever been. Even though I surrendered them yesterday and God took them yesterday, they might come back today stronger than they ever been. And what's important is that I move forward, that I surrender them up, that I go back through the steps with them and let them go again and rely on God. And through that process, that's what I've started doing with myself. Every time that comes up, and the more I do that, the more I learn to trust myself, the more I learn to trust God. and the thoughts don't come nearly as much. And I actually kind of like myself a little bit now. It's much more of a tempered like myself than it was before I hit recovery, where I was either this manic, like I'm the greatest thing in the world, I am lowercase g God trying to hold my fragile universe together, or I absolutely hate myself and my self-esteem is in the toilet. Hopefully that helps answer the question.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I appreciate that. I've got a question for you that I wrote down, and you briefly talked about your inner child in your share just a little bit. Are you willing to share a little bit and go a little bit deeper into that? What in your experience with your inner child in this healing process?
Yeah. So the thought came about really. Again, this is a Harvey introduced topic for me. But another person that's really kind of had an impact in those conversations for me has been Leonard, and I believe he's on tonight or today too. But the concept, right, is that inside each of us there is this inner child who, because of my addiction, right, I'll talk about myself. I have this inner child who stopped growing up, stopped progressing at a certain age because of the practice of my addiction. Emotionally, I got stuck because I no longer was actually learning to process through my emotions. I wasn't giving myself the time of day. I locked him in a box to try to keep him safe from the world. And really the only thing that produced was resentment and self-hate. And really my self-worth really, really left. That inner child, just like I think any child would feel. If you lock them away in a room, you don't let them come out, you don't let them talk or interact with anybody, they're going to start feeling they're pretty worthless. And that's exactly the relationship that I had with myself. So listening in those group meetings in those parking lots that we had after that were just so impactful for my recovery. If you can make it work, stay for parking lots and talk. There has been so much good that's come out of those conversations for me. But I learned that that's kind of the relationship that I had with myself. And like I mentioned in the intro, I hid that inner child away through really just not acknowledging that he existed, not acknowledging that he was there. Like I had to be in control of my emotions. I had to be outwardly in control. Nobody could know what was on the inside, because if they saw that inner child, for sure they were going to hate him like I did. And for sure they were going to be disgusted with him like I was. And so what happened as I learned from these guys in recovery and listened to their relationship with themselves grow, one of the pieces of advice that was given, or not really advice, one of the experiences that was shared was the idea of trying to identify the age of that child, that inner child. And I figured that at the start of this process, my inner child was probably about 6. And he just hadn't really progressed past then. And I actually went through some conversations with my parents, and I said, can you help me understand? Because I don't remember a lot of my childhood. I've spent so much time trying to block that out. I honestly do not remember a lot of my childhood. I remember some things, but not a lot. And so I actually had conversations with my parents and asked them to help me remember and understand what it was, or what I was like as a kid, so I could know how to interact with myself on the inside. So I started to have conversations with myself. I created a safe mental place for that child to come out. And he was scared to come out for a good long while. And sometimes there's still things that he still is really, really hesitant to come out for. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of trust, not just trust with God or with myself, but even trust with my wife, which is the next relationship that really needs to have the most self-amends, right? Or the most living amends applied. We had this conversation the other night where we talked about how there's still a major tendency for me, even though my wife has given me no reason at all to believe that she wouldn't be a safe place for me to go, which is remarkable given my addiction. Even though that's the case, I still don't necessarily feel safe all the time. And talking to her even about how sometimes I feel just down, or I don't feel like I want to connect, right? Even just saying that, being honest about it, that doesn't feel like a safe thing to say to her sometimes. But being able to be honest with the inner child and let the inner child grow up a little bit and have a little bit more emotional maturity. And in the last couple of years, I don't know how old he is now. He's probably progressed to be probably 8 or 9. But he's become more interactive with me. And really, when I read that letter to myself, I had already understood the concept of having the inner child, and that's why I read that letter too. I mean, as a 6-year-old who had pretty good understanding of the English language, but that was one of the most remarkable experiences, was having that sort of an interaction and having a daily process of being able to follow up with myself and ask myself some questions. So I'll share these really quick. These are some of my accountability type questions that I gave myself after I wrote that letter to help make sure that I was being accountable to my inner child, to make sure that I was learning and growing. So I asked myself these questions from time to time. I said, have I been honest with you today? And these are questions that I'm asking that inner child. So where did I try to pause and listen to you today? How have I shown you love today? How have I shown you your worth today? How have I worked towards, what have I worked towards today? What did your emotional sides try to tell you today? How have I accepted and supported the little boy today? And how did I try to what did I try to run from today? And the most incredible thing about having that relationship and focusing on my relationship with myself as an inner child, one of the most amazing blessings for me has been that I've seen it really change the way that I interact with my kids. That's the most visible, by far the most visible fruit of recovery for me, has been watching my relationships with my kids change in a much, much more positive way.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. One more question here before we go into wrap things up. You talked a little bit about, well, it was in your bio, about the need to be right. Your analytical and logical brain, that you're an engineer, you're a bright guy, intelligent. You can probably figure out a lot of day-to-day things on your own. I'm thinking that I'm more intelligent than I probably really am here, but one of the harder things for me to realize in this walk was that I don't got this. And you talked a little bit about how you got to the point where you realized self-knowledge wasn't going to work, but dig a little bit deeper there. Talk about your own experience in coming to the place where, no matter how much I learn, I'm not going to be able to do this on my own. Man,
I get a little bit emotional about this one because it really was a huge part of my identity. Like most of my identity was surrounded and really connected to being the smart kid, knowing what I was talking about and being right. If I was not right, then it meant that I wasn't worth as much in my head. I know that's not true, right? But that's how I felt. So there's a saying in recovery that I'm sure that most everybody who's on and most everybody who's listening has probably heard, and that's that I've never met anybody too stupid to work the steps, but I've met a whole lot of people who are too smart to work them. That phrase really holds a very, very powerful place for me because I spent a lot of time being too smart to work the steps. That if I could just learn enough about them, that I would free myself from it. If I just had there was one key that I was looking for, one piece of information that I was looking for, But if I just knew it, I would convince myself to not act out anymore. And in the end, just getting to a place where I acted out so much that I just felt sick. I got to a place where I hated myself. I got to a place where I no longer felt like I could accept myself where I was at, because I was wrong. And I had to finally let go of my ego. We say in recovery that you have to be willing to let go of everything. Like everything. You have to let go of everything. I have to be willing to give my entire self to God. The good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between. That really is, and it's a scary thing, especially if you haven't taken step 2. It was super scary for me because I really didn't trust God. I knew who he was supposed to be, but I didn't really think he was that way. There's a huge, huge disconnect between those two things. Really what it came down to is, was I willing to do whatever it takes, including letting go of myself? And in the end, that was just it. And it's one of those super simple, I don't know how to go into it much deeper other than to say, I just had to let go of myself. And if you're somebody listening to this, and you don't feel like you can, or if you feel like you don't know what that means, the only way that I know how to teach that to anybody is to turn them to God and say, go ask God. Go ask your higher power. And if you're ready for it, and if you really are sincere, he will teach you what that means. And he'll help you do it because he's on your team, because he loves you, and he thinks you are absolutely worth saving. He thinks you're absolutely worth it. You're worth it to him. And he really wants you to feel that way about yourself. And the thing is that having yourself saved, having him save you, there's going to be some stuff that needs to change over time, because in the end, saving means being more like him. But it's totally worth it. And guess what? I can say that I'm wrong now. And I say it often because I am wrong often, and that's okay. It was hard to let go of, but it's so much better not having to carry that. It's so much better not feeling like I have to be sitting in God's throne, literally trying to hold my fragile world together. I don't have the skill set to be God. I don't. I'm really bad at it. I've proven that for 32 years. And I'm grateful I don't have to have that job. I'm grateful he wants to fill that job for me.
Awesome. Brian, we had a couple of comments and a question come in here. And one of the comments was what you just shared there hit a really, well, to use the words, a huge issue with a couple of our live attendees. And I really appreciate your share there. I think it was led by your higher power to touch me and others. Also, we're going to about ready to start wrapping this up. We have a question that came in. Ryan, can you please share which 12-step program you're referring to in the majority of your talk?
Yeah, so the 12-step program that I've been attending as far as group goes is SAL. That's very, very similar to SA. There's a couple of little key differences. Probably most notably, for prayers, we don't just share written recovery prayers. We also do prayers from the heart in our meetings. And then I haven't been to a whole lot of SA groups, but I hear a lot of guys who have been to a lot of both, and they talk about how in SAL groups, we tend to talk about God or our higher power being the solution probably more often than in SA. Those are basically the differences there. We use a lot of in fact, we use the SA White Book and the SA Step into Action book as our primary study material, along with the AA literature. So that's pretty much what I've been referring to. I also have referred to a little bit ARP support. I'm not going to go into this in a whole lot of detail, but basically it's a sponsorship program that is meant to kind of supplement a recovery group. It started out as a support to ARP, hence the name ARP support. But because of the lack of recovery in a lot of those groups, the focus has shifted, and we found that there's more recovery, and it's been more helpful to us to attend the SAL or SA groups. But personally, for me, I've been attending SAL groups.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan. And before we wrap up, I'm going to have you share just a minute of words of wisdom. But before that, the inner child questions, if you wouldn't mind, Ryan, emailing those to me that you ask yourself. I'll put those in the show notes of the podcast. You can all find it. If you go look up the podcast, you can find those questions there. Also, other references and resources that Ryan has referred to, they will all be there with links so that you can look into them yourself if you want. Ryan, if you wouldn't mind sharing 1 minute of words of wisdom for us before we close this out.
When it all comes down to it, the solution for me has been working the steps. And not just to work the steps or not just to learn about them, but to work them with God, with my higher power, however you want to call him. It's the same guy. That's really all this is. The 12 steps are about having that spiritual connection, that spiritual solution for a spiritual problem. That's all this is. It really is that simple. Like to myself and to anybody else who has the same problem as me, I can always do with that reminder that I might just be overthinking it. If it feels hard, I'm probably doing it wrong. I really appreciate the comment that's been made on this podcast before, that I don't really work the steps so much as they work me, that they overcome me, they overtake me. If I really am including God in this process, it comes really naturally. If I really am willing, if I really think I'm worth it, now with that, I'll pass.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was a great RECO12 weekly speaker meeting for all addicts and those wanting to learn more about addiction and the recovery therefrom. If we didn't get your questions, or if you have other questions, you can either email me at RECO12pod@gmail.com, RECO12pod@gmail.com, or go to the website RECO12.com/forum and join in our community and ask those questions there. I invite you to come back next week. We have these meetings every week. And if you have not yet gone to RECO12.com and submitted your email address to get on the mailing list, invitation list, so you can join us each Friday live at noon Central Time. Next week, we'll be hearing from Pamela B. from Great Britain, whose topic will be going deeper in challenging times. Now, next week, we may be recording at a different time. I'll send out all of that information as soon as we have it finalized. So you can have that if you're on the email list. Before we launch off into the day, Ryan has offered to send us off with a prayer from the heart. So, Ryan, the floor is back to you for that prayer.
Our Father in heaven, we are really, truly grateful for the chance that we've had to come together and talk here about recovery. I am very grateful for the chance to share a little bit of my story, but especially to be able to share the words of wisdom and the things that have come to me through other members of my groups, which I believe have all been rooted in starting with you. We pray for other addicts who are out there who are still suffering with their addictions. We pray for the man who is still sick and the woman who is still sick out there. We believe that you are aware of each of us and each of them. We pray that each person who is listening or who will listen to this will be able to feel with thy love, that acceptance. We pray that each person who needs help letting go will receive that help. Please help them to understand how they can come closer to Thee through working the steps. They've been a blessing to me, and they've been a blessing to many other people who are listening. We are grateful for that inspiration who came to the founding members of AA and to the members of the Oxford group originally. Please help us to continue to work the steps, to continue to stay connected to Thee, and to remember that it's not about what we can do, it's about what You can do. We are grateful for Justin and his willingness to listen to the promptings that he had to work his step 12 through providing this podcast. We're grateful for all of the speakers who have spoken and who will speak in this podcast, and we pray that the things that they share will be led and guided by Thee. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Keep coming back, everybody. It works when I work it, so work it. You are worth it.
Standing still a moment, carving out this time, reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine. Peaks too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep to walk through without incurring loss. Yet here I am, still standing tall, despite the rough terrain. One like me survived the storms and walked through wind and rain. Still standing, I will fight the good fight, still searching for glimmers of